Hi, everybody. I'm Nathan McDonald. I'm here with Bonnie Gray. We're from Parks and Recreation's History and Science in the Parks divisions. Today, we're here to talk a little bit about the life of the wetlands that you can see behind me here at Neabsco Creek. Bonnie will be covering some of the natural life cycles of plants and animals and the wetlands themselves. And I'll be talking a little bit first, kind of how these wetlands formed and sort of humanity's relationship to the wetlands over history. So, talking about that, going back in time to the earliest human settlements in this area, we know very little about them. We know some about the people that replaced them, the Dogue people who crossed the Potomac and came and settled this area sometime probably in the 1500s or a little bit earlier. They replaced a tribe that they recorded very little of. In 1609, John Smith, sailing up the Potomac River, spoke with and met with the Dogue in this area, primarily at Tuxant, which was their principal sort of capital town that was up near Occoquan, kind of over across the creek on Mason Neck. They had lived here for a very long time by that point, and mainly made their lifestyles off of farming along the banks of the rivers and then fishing and crabbing, getting mussels, clams, oysters from the rivers to supplement their diet. Neabsco actually comes from the English phonetic spelling trying to render the Dogue word for this place, which John Smith recorded as Neabsco. Over time, it sort of metamorphosized and became Neabsco. What that means, we don't exactly know. The Dogue spoke an Algonquin language, which is a fairly well-known and in some places living language today, but with the regional variations between it, it's hard to say exactly what that name transliterates to mean. So after the Dogue, European settlers spread up the Potomac, pushing the native people either back across the Potomac to their neighbors, the Nanticoke and Maryland's eastern shore, or some of them went west into the mountains with other tribes in the area. And eventually they wound up either in upstate New York or in Canada, even in some cases, where their descendants did. The European settlers, this area was platted and then turned into plantations fairly early on. In the mid to late 1600s, mostly for tobacco. To the north side of the river, it eventually became Ripon Lodge Plantation, which was over 1,000 acres along the north shore of the Neabsco Creek. And on the south shore, you had Leesylvania, which was the property of Henry Lee and his family. And then further inland, towards US 1 and Interstate 95 today, was the Taylor family property. Unlike the other two plantation farms, Taylor Iron Works was an ironworks. They mined iron ore, imported iron ore, put it in a blast furnace, and through that process turned it into finished pig iron to be made into various products. What all three of those operations have in common, though, is that all of the labor is performed by enslaved people. Whether it's the industrial operation, whether it's the farming, whether it's fishing in any of these places, woodworking and carpentry business, a mill, almost all the actual labor is done by enslaved people or hired white supervisors that are largely Irish, Scottish, or German. This area from that, all of that plantation land, all that clearing for the wood to make charcoal, to burn the iron ore, or to make plant crops for the plantations, does away with the trees along the creeks. And between that and other development over the life of the creek, caused eventually silt and dirt to run into and run off the hills and into Neabsco Creek. So that by the mid-1800s, this creek had filled in all except for a very narrow channel that the Army Corps of Engineers kept dredged clear. And even that closed beyond the mouth of the creek by the early 1920s, 1930s. So since then, the wetlands has been the dominant life of Neabsco Creek. The wetlands, the wildlife. But we'll turn that over to Bonnie to talk a little more about that.
Today we're here at the Neabsco Creek Wetlands area. Picture years and years and hundreds of years ago, where it's a deep and thriving river. Further in the city, in the States, we're having all sorts of new development. Houses are being built, farms are being built, trees are being removed for logging. In all of that deforestation, we have all this silt and dirt that is coming down the creek that ends up here. Why does it end up here? Well, it's got to stop somewhere. As the creek slows, the dirt stops. That's what the erosion does. It brings it down here and fills in the creek. And as the creek fills with silt and dirt, it brings in seeds. The birds come in and deposit seeds, and this is what we have hundreds of years later. The wetlands is a key filter for our water cycle. A watershed is where all of the water pours down into an area. And this is part of the reclamation of our water. The water filters through the grasses, through the dirt, ends up in our groundwater again, or it goes out to the Potomac, which leads then to the Chesapeake Bay, which we are part of the Chesapeake Bay watershed here. So the wetlands are important for our water cycle, but they're also a really key ecosystem. Here you can see the lilies and the cattails and other plants that are here, creating habitats for all of our animals. You can see the red-winged blackbirds flying by. You can see herons and eagles and ospreys. You can see the turtles and the frogs and all of the other animals that live here. We have a thriving fish population that lay their eggs here, and the babies grow up here. And then they can access the Potomac River and other larger bodies of water. If you go to a wetlands area, you can look for birds. You can look for eagles and ospreys in the Northern Virginia area. You can find herons. You can find locally here, we have a lot of red-winged blackbirds. They're the primary birds that I see when I'm out here. And also have a tendency to have muddy areas where you can see the tracks of deer and beaver and muskrat and raccoons. You can see frogs and turtles on logs and sunning in areas. So all of those animals can be found here. Dragonflies and butterflies are very prolific during different seasons here. Grasshoppers have a big influx in our wetlands and a big population in our wetlands. You'll find different creatures in wetland areas. One time we found a big, huge quantity of green tree frogs, which you wouldn't really necessarily expect in a wetland area. And so seasonally, it changes. The lilies grow up and the lilies die back. And the grasses are green and the grasses are brown. And the seasons significantly impact who and what is active in our wetlands. Our wetlands need to be protected. They provide water. They provide protection from storm surges. So all of the rain that comes from the area that ends up here into the wetlands, this protects it from flooding elsewhere. And it also we have to protect it by picking up our trash, by not letting that bag fly away, by throwing away things in a proper receptacle so that it doesn't get caught in the rain and the wind and end up here. Imagine this scenery covered in plastic bags or old tires. We don't want that. So pick up after yourself and appreciate the wetlands.
Thanks, Bonnie. That was a great overview as well. But thank you all out there for joining us for Wetlands Month and Historic Preservation Month. If you're interested in finding out more about Neabsco Creek, more about our programs and other events, check out pwcparks.org and pwcgov.org/history for more information on this area.